The screams echoed through the void of space as another world burned. Vorthak watched from the command deck of his flagship, the Bone Crown, as the blue-green planet below turned black with smoke. His 3 yellow eyes showed no emotion as millions of lives ended in flames. This was just another Tuesday for the galaxy's most feared predator, standing 12 feet tall with chitinous black scales that had never been pierced. Vorthak commanded respect through pure terror. His 4 powerful arms could crush steel, and the plasma blades at his side had carved through the hulls of 1,000 starships. For 3 centuries he had conquered world after world, building an empire of fear that stretched across 17 star systems. The bridge crew of various alien species worked in deadly silence around him. They knew better than to speak unless spoken to. The last officer who had dared interrupt Vorthak's contemplation was now decorating the ship's hull as a frozen corpse. Fear was the only language these creatures understood, and Vorthak spoke it fluently. "My lord," whispered his second-in-command, a scarred reptilian named Krex. "The planet's defenses have fallen. The population centers are burning as ordered." Vorthak nodded slowly. "Good. Signal the fleet. We move to the next target in 6 hours. But as he turned to leave, a tactical officer's voice cracked with nervousness. "Sir, there's one more settlement. A small colony on the northern continent. Our scans show mixed species there." "Burn it," Vorthak said without hesitation. "Sir, it appears to be a peaceful colony. Medical facilities, farms, schools, no military presence." Vorthak's massive head turned toward the officer, and the alien immediately regretted speaking. "Did I stutter, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. Beginning orbital bombardment now." The energy beams lanced down from the Bone Crown, turning forests into ash and lakes into steam. But something nagged at Vorthak as he watched the destruction. Intelligence reports had mentioned this colony was different. It was run by various species working together, which was unusual. Most worlds he conquered were dominated by one species. That oppressed others. More interesting was the mention of a human among the colonists. Vorthak had heard stories about humans. They were supposedly a young species from a small blue world called Earth. The reports described them as physically weak but mentally resilient. He had conquered worlds full of species that were supposedly resilient. They all broke eventually. "Sir," the tactical officer announced, "the settlement's shields are holding. They have some kind of medical facility with enhanced protection?" Vorthak's eyes narrowed. "Medical facility? Yes, sir. It appears to be the colony's main hospital. Multiple species are taking shelter there." For reasons he couldn't explain, Vorthak felt a strange curiosity. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never encountered a hospital that was built to withstand orbital bombardment. Most civilizations prioritize military defenses over medical facilities. What kind of people would build their hospitals stronger than their weapons? "Cease bombardment," he commanded. The bridge fell silent. No one had expected this order. "Sir?" Krex asked carefully. "I said cease bombardment." "Prepare my personal transport. I'm going down there." "My lord, that's not advisable. The remaining colonists might be armed." Vorthak's laugh was like grinding stone. "Are you suggesting that I, the scourge of 17 systems, fear a few colonists in a medical facility?" "Of course not, sir." "But why risk personal involvement?" "We could simply increase the bombardment intensity." "Because," Vorthak said, moving toward the transport bay, "I want to see what kind of fools build hospitals stronger than fortresses." His personal guard of 6 elite warriors followed him to the transport ship. These were veterans who had survived countless battles by Vorthak's side. They had seen him tear through enemy lines single-handedly, had watched him break the will of entire civilizations with his bare hands as the transport descended through the burning atmosphere. Vorthak reflected on his long career of conquest. He had destroyed civilizations that had stood for millennia. He had ended bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of their species. He had taken worlds that were considered impregnable and turned them into graveyards. Yet something about this small colony intrigued him. Perhaps it was the unusual cooperation between species. or the strange prioritization of medical facilities over military ones, or perhaps it was simply the mention of a human. In all his conquests, he had never encountered one of these creatures. Personally, the transport touched down in the colony's main square, crushing the remains of what had once been a beautiful fountain. Smoke rose from the surrounding buildings, and the air was thick with the smell of burning vegetation. But the medical facility stood undamaged, its shields still glowing with protective energy. Vorthik stepped out of the transport, his massive frame casting a shadow across the rubble. His guards flanked him, weapons ready. But as they approached the medical facility, something unexpected happened. The shields lowered. "Sir," one of his guards whispered, "it could be a trap." Vorthik drew two of his plasma blades, their energy humming with deadly promise. "Let them try." The facility's main doors opened with a soft hiss. No armies emerged, no weapons fired. Instead, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was small by galactic standards, perhaps 6 feet tall, with pale skin and soft features. It wore simple clothes stained with what appeared to be blood. The figure looked directly at Vorthik without flinching. This was unexpected. Most beings cowered in his presence, unable to meet his gaze. But this creature, presumably the human, simply stood there with calm eyes. "You're injured," the human said, pointing to a small cut on Vorthik's shoulder where debris had struck him during the descent. Vorthik looked down at the minor wound, then back at the human. In 3 centuries of conquest, no one had ever begun a conversation with him by expressing concern for his well-being. "You dare to speak to me?" "All wounds need attention," the human replied simply. "My name is David. I run the medical facility. Here, you're bleeding." Vorthik's guards raised their weapons, but he held up a hand to stop them. This was the most interesting interaction he had experienced in decades. Most beings either begged for mercy or tried to attack him. This human was doing neither. "I am Vorthik, the scourge of 17 systems. I have burned your world and killed your people." "And you offer me medical attention?" David nodded. "That's what healers do. We heal." For the first time in 3 centuries, Vorthik was genuinely puzzled. He had conquered species that were stronger, faster, and more technologically advanced than humans. But none of them had ever confused him like this small, soft creature who seemed completely unafraid of death itself. The medical facility's interior was unlike anything Vorthik had ever seen in his centuries of conquest. Instead of the cold, sterile environments he was used to, this place felt warm and alive. Soft lighting cast gentle shadows on walls decorated with artwork from dozens of different species. The air smelled of healing herbs rather than disinfectant. David led him through corridors filled with the wounded. Vorthik's guards tensed as they passed aliens from various species, but none of them showed the expected fear. Instead, they looked at David with something Vorthik had rarely encountered in his conquests: genuine affection and trust. "How many species live in this colony?" Vorthik asked as they walked. 17 different ones," David replied, stopping to check on a wounded creature with blue fur and large eyes. "The Altani were here first. They're farmers, mostly. Good people. The others came later, refugees from various conflicts." Vorthik recognized some of the species. The Altani had been displaced when he conquered their homeworld 50 years ago. The blue-furred creatures were Zephyrians, survivors of a civil war he had escalated for his own purposes. There were others, too, all carrying the scars of his past. Victories. "You harbor my enemies?" he observed. David looked up from his patient. "I harbor the wounded. That's different." They entered a larger room where dozens of injured beings lay on beds. Some were colonists hurt in the recent bombardment, but others wore the uniforms of Vorthik's own forces. The sight of his soldiers being treated alongside their victims was so alien to him that he stopped walking. "You treat my warriors," he said, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Wounds don't care about sides," David replied, moving to check on a reptilian soldier whose arm was wrapped in bandages. "Pain is pain." The soldier looked up as David approached, his eyes going wide when he saw Vorthik. He tried to sit up, but David gently pushed him back down. Rest, David told the soldier. That bone needs time to heal properly. Vorthok watched this interaction with growing bewilderment. His soldiers were trained to fight through any injury, to ignore pain and continue fighting until death. The concept of taking time to heal properly was foreign to his military doctrine. Why do you waste resources on enemy soldiers? He asked. David finished adjusting the soldier's bandages before answering. Because they're not my enemies. They're just people who got hurt? The simplicity of the statement hit Vorthok like a physical blow. In his worldview, there were only two categories of beings, those who served him and those who opposed him. The idea that someone could exist outside this binary system was incomprehensible. They moved to a smaller room where David kept his supplies. The human began gathering medical equipment, his movements efficient and practiced. Vorthok sat on a reinforced chair that creaked under his massive weight. "Remove your upper armor," David instructed. Vorthok's guards stepped forward, alarmed. No one gave orders to their commander. But Vorthok raised a hand to stop them. He was curious to see where this strange encounter would lead. The armor came off in sections, revealing the scared black scales beneath. Vorthok's body was a map of 3 centuries of warfare. Blade cuts, plasma burns, and impact wounds covered his torso like medals of violence. David examined the fresh wound on his shoulder with professional interest. This is actually deeper than it looks. The debris must have hit at just the right angle. As David began cleaning the wound, Vorthok found himself studying the human more closely. The creature's hands were steady and sure, showing no fear despite touching the most feared predator in the galaxy. His fingers were gentle but firm, and there was something almost hypnotic about his movements. "You're not afraid," Vorthok observed. "Fear doesn't help with healing," David replied, continuing his work. "It just makes everything harder. Fear is how I control my empire." David paused in his work, looking up at Vorthok's face. "Does it work?" The question caught Vorthok off guard. "What do you mean? Does ruling through fear give you what you want?" Vorthok considered this. What did he want? He had conquered world after world, accumulated wealth beyond measure, and commanded armies that could destroy star systems, but as he sat in this quiet medical room, he realized he couldn't remember what his original goal had been. "I want order," he said finally, "and do you have it?" Vorthok thought about his empire. It was held together by constant military presence and the threat of violence. Rebellions erupted regularly, requiring brutal suppression. His subordinates plotted against each other and sometimes against him. It was order, but it was order maintained by endless violence. "It's complicated," he admitted. David smiled, the first genuine smile Vorthok had seen directed at him in decades. "Most important things are," as David worked, he talked about the colony. He described how the different species had learned to work together, how they had combined their various talents to create something none of them could have achieved alone. The Altani were excellent farmers, the Zephyons were skilled engineers, and the humans provided medical knowledge that had saved countless lives. "How do you maintain order without fear?" Vorthok asked. "We don't maintain order," David replied, applying a healing salve to the wound. "We maintain community. When people care about each other, they don't need to be controlled." The concept was so foreign to Vorthok that he struggled to process it. In his experience, beings were naturally selfish and violent. Order could only be imposed through superior force. The idea that people might cooperate voluntarily seemed like naive idealism, but as he looked around the medical facility, he saw evidence that contradicted his worldview. Beings from different species were working together, sharing resources, caring for each other's young. There were no guards, no weapons, no surveillance systems, yet everything functioned smoothly. "There," David said, finishing the bandage. "That should heal nicely. Try not to strain it for a few days." A few days. The casual assumption that Vorthok would be alive and thinking about his health in a few days was startling. Most beings who encountered him were focused on surviving the next few minutes. As David cleaned his instruments, Vorthok found himself reluctant to leave. The medical facility was peaceful in a way he had forgotten existed. The sounds of healing, Rather than dying, the smell of medicines rather than smoke, the sight of beings helping each other rather than fighting. "Why did you lower your shields?" he asked. David looked up from his cleaning. "Because you were hurt." "I came here to kill you, I know, but you were still hurt." The simple logic of it was maddening. Vorthak had built his reputation on being utterly ruthless, yet here was a being who had risked everything to offer him medical care. It challenged everything he thought he knew about survival and power. One of his guards cleared his throat. "Sir, the fleet is waiting for orders." Vorthak looked at his subordinate, then back at David. The human was already moving on to his next patient, a small Altany child who had been injured in the bombardment. He watched David's gentle hands examine the child's injuries, speaking in soft tones that seemed to calm the young being's fears. For the first time in 3 centuries, Vorthak didn't know what to do next. Sleep had abandoned Vorthak completely. He paced the corridors of the Bone Crown through the ship's artificial night cycle, his massive footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The encounter with the human had left him restless and confused in ways he couldn't understand. His quarters were filled with trophies from 1,000 conquests. Weapons taken from fallen enemies, artwork stolen from burning worlds, and precious stones mined by slave labor. Each item represented a victory, a world broken beneath his will. But tonight, they all seemed empty and meaningless. He paused before a mirror and studied his reflection. The bandage on his shoulder was still clean and white, a stark contrast to his dark scales. David's handiwork was precise and careful. The human had spent more time treating that single wound than most of Vorthak's own medics spent on their patients. The galaxy's most feared predator had never considered the concept of gentle healing. In his world, injuries were either fatal or ignored. Pain was weakness to be overcome through force of will. The idea that someone would take time to ease suffering rather than simply endure it was revolutionary. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. Krex appeared on the communication screen, his scarred face showing concern. "My lord, the fleet commanders are requesting orders. Do we proceed to the next target system?" Vorthak looked at the star charts displaying their planned route of conquest. 7 more worlds waited to be burned. Millions more beings would die. It was the pattern he had followed for 3 centuries. "Delay the departure," he heard himself say. "You heard me. Delay departure. I'm returning to the surface." Krex's eyes widened. "My lord, is that wise? The colonists might attempt revenge?" "Let them try." But even as he said it, Vorthak knew the colonists wouldn't attack. They were too busy healing each other to waste energy on revenge. The thought should have disgusted him, but instead, it filled him with a strange fascination. He returned to the colony as the local sun was rising. The devastation from the previous day's bombardment was evident everywhere. Burned buildings, scattered debris, and the lingering smell of smoke. But already, he could see beings working to clear the damage and help their neighbors. The medical facility was busier than before. More of his soldiers had apparently sought treatment there. During the night, they worked alongside the colonists they had been trying to kill just hours earlier, sharing tools and supplies. David was in the main treatment room, suturing a wound on a young Altany's arm. His movements were precise and careful, and he hummed softly as he worked. The sound was soothing in a way that Vorthak had never experienced. "You came back?" David observed without looking up from his work. "I don't know why. Sometimes the most important things don't have clear reasons." Vorthak watched David finish the sutures and bandage the wound. The young Altany thanked him with obvious gratitude before leaving. Every patient seemed to genuinely care about David, and he clearly cared about them in return. "How do you do it?" Vorthak asked. "Do what?" "Care about strangers, beings you've never met before yesterday." David considered the question while washing his hands. "I don't think of them as strangers. They're just people I haven't helped yet." The answer was so simple that it took Vorthak several moments to process it. In his worldview, unknown beings were potential threats or resources to be exploited. The idea that they might simply be people who needed help was entirely foreign. "I was a healer once," Vorthak said quietly. David looked up, showing no surprise. What happened? War. My world was attacked by a coalition of species that feared our growing influence. My people were scattered, our cities burned. I was young then, working in a clinic much like this one. Vorthak hadn't spoken about his past in over 2 centuries. The memories were painful, buried beneath layers of rage and violence. But something about David's calm presence made the words come easier. The attackers came to our clinic during the worst of the fighting. They were looking for wounded soldiers to execute. I tried to protect my patients, but I was just a healer. I had no weapons, no training in combat. What did you do? I learned to fight. I learned to kill. I got stronger, faster, more ruthless. I told myself it was about protecting my people, but they were already dead. I was just feeding my rage. David nodded slowly. And the healing? I forgot about it, convinced myself it was weakness. But caring about others was a luxury I couldn't afford. But you never really forgot? Vorthak looked at him sharply. What do you mean? You could have simply destroyed this colony from orbit. You could have killed everyone here without ever setting foot on the surface. But you didn't. You came down here personally. The observation was uncomfortable in its accuracy. Vorthak had indeed broken his own protocols by coming to the surface. He had put himself at risk for reasons he couldn't explain, even to himself. I wanted to see what kind of fools built hospitals stronger than fortresses, he said defensively. And what did you find? Vorthak looked around the medical facility. He saw beings from 17 different species working together, sharing resources, caring for each other's wounded. He saw his own soldiers being treated with the same gentleness as their former enemies. I found people who remember what I forgot. David began preparing supplies for his next patient. It's not about forgetting, it's about choosing what to remember. I've done terrible things. Destroyed worlds, ended bloodlines, caused suffering on a scale that can't be measured. Yes, you have. The simple acknowledgement hit harder than any accusation could have. David didn't try to minimize or excuse his actions. He simply accepted them as reality. Then how can you treat me like you do the others? Because who you were and who you are now aren't the same as who you could become? Vorthak sat heavily in the reinforced chair. The weight of 3 centuries of violence pressed down on him like a physical force he had built his identity around. Being the galaxy's most feared predator, but sitting in this peaceful medical facility, he felt hollow and lost. I don't know how to be anything else. You don't have to change everything at once. Just choose differently in the next moment. A new patient entered the room, one of Vorthak's senior officers with a broken leg. The officer's eyes went wide when he saw his commander sitting there like a regular patient. Sir, I can return to duty immediately. Sit down, Vorthak commanded. Let the human treat your injury. The officer obeyed, though his confusion was obvious. As David examined the broken bone, Vorthak found himself studying the human's technique. A gentle probing, the careful questions about pain levels, the obvious concern for the patient's. Comfort. You're wasting time, the officer said to David. Just give me something for the pain and I'll manage. Bones don't heal properly if they're not set correctly, David replied calmly. This will take a few minutes, but you'll be able to walk normally afterward. Vorthak watched his officer's face change as David worked. The constant tension that all his soldiers carried began to ease. The officer's breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. By the time David finished, the soldier looked more at peace than Vorthak had ever seen him. Thank you, the officer said. And the gratitude in his voice was genuine. As the officer left, Vorthak realized something profound had just occurred. One of his most hardened warriors had been changed by a simple act of healing. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. You're changing them, he said to David. I'm just treating their wounds. They're changing themselves. But Vorthak understood what was really happening. David wasn't just healing bodies. He was healing something deeper, something that had been broken in all of them by years of violence and fear. The third day brought more changes that Vorthak couldn't ignore. His soldiers were arriving at the medical facility in greater numbers, not just for treatment but to help with the work. They carried supplies, assisted with patient care, and even helped rebuild damaged sections of the colony. Vorthok stood in the facility's main corridor, watching his most elite warriors work alongside the beings they had been trying to kill just days earlier. The transformation was so complete that he questioned whether these were the same soldiers who had helped him burn countless worlds. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" David said, joining him in the corridor. "They're not following orders," Vorthok replied, confusion evident in his voice. "I didn't command them to help rebuild." "No, you didn't. They're choosing to help." The concept of his soldiers acting independently in a positive way was alien to Vorthok. His entire command structure was built on absolute obedience and fear-based compliance. The idea that his warriors might make good choices on their own challenged everything he thought he knew about leadership. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you inspire this kind of behavior without threats or violence?" David watched as one of the soldiers helped an elderly Altany carry medical supplies. "I don't inspire anything. I just treat them like people instead of weapons. But they are weapons. I train them to be weapons." "They're people who learn to be weapons. There's a difference." Vorthok followed David to a smaller room where several patients were resting. Among them was a young Altany female who had been severely injured in the initial bombardment. Her blue fur was patched with bandages and one of her arms was immobilized. In a healing cast. "How is she?" Vorthok asked. "Better. The bone is healing well, and the internal injuries are responding to treatment. She make a full recovery." As if sensing their conversation, the young Altany opened her large eyes and looked directly at Vorthok. Instead of the fear he expected, he saw something else entirely: curiosity. "You're the one who hurt us," she said simply. "Yes, but you're also the one who stopped." Vorthok knelt beside her bed, bringing his massive frame down to her level. "I am. Why?" The question was asked with the directness that only children possessed. No manipulation, no hidden agenda, just genuine curiosity about his motivations. "Because I remembered something I thought I had lost," he said. "What did you remember?" Vorthok looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "I remembered what it felt like to heal instead of hurt." The child considered this for a long moment. "Will you remember it tomorrow?" "I hope so." She smiled, and the simple expression of trust and hope hit Vorthok like a physical blow. In all his conquests, he had never seen a being look at him with anything other than fear or hatred. This child, whom he had nearly killed, was offering him forgiveness he didn't deserve. Later that evening, Vorthok found himself in the facility's garden. The colonists had built a small outdoor space where patients could recover in fresh air and natural light. It was here that he encountered an unexpected visitor. Krex stood among the flowering plants, his scarred face reflecting deep thought. His second-in-command had served with him for over a century, participating in countless battles and conquests. "Sir," Krex said, "the fleet commanders are growing restless. They're questioning the delay in our departure. Let them question." "Sir, with respect, this behavior is unprecedented. The troops are confused, and some of the commanders are beginning to wonder if you've been compromised somehow." Vorthok looked at his oldest and most trusted officer. "What do you think, Krex?" "I think," Krex said carefully, "that I've never seen you at peace before." The observation was startling in its accuracy. Vorthok realized that the constant tension he had carried for 3 centuries was gone. The rage that had driven him from world to world had been replaced by something he couldn't name. "Is that what this is? Peace?" "I don't know, sir. But I know that I've spent the last 3 days helping to heal instead of destroy, and I can't remember the last time I felt this clean." Vorthok studied his second-in-command more closely. Krex's posture was different, more relaxed. The permanent scowl that had marked his face for decades was gone, replaced by something that might have been contentment. "The human changed you too." "He didn't change me, sir. He just reminded me who I used to be." David appeared in the garden, carrying a small potted plant. He nodded to both of them before kneeling to tend to one of the flower beds. "David," Vorthok sighed, "my officers are questioning my decisions. They think I've been compromised." "Have you?" "I don't know. I feel different." less angry, less certain about everything. David continued his work with the plants as he spoke. Anger is easy. It gives you clear enemies and simple solutions. But it also burns everything it touches, including the person carrying it. My empire was built on that anger. And what has it cost you? Vorthik thought about the question. His empire was vast and powerful, but it required constant violence to maintain. He had no friends, only subordinates who feared him. He had no peace, only the temporary satisfaction of conquest. He had no joy, only the brief rush of victory before the emptiness returned. Everything, he said quietly. Then maybe it's time to build something else. The words hung in the air between them. Vorthak had never considered the possibility of building instead of destroying. His entire identity was tied to conquest and domination. The idea of creating something positive seemed impossible. I don't know how. Start small. Choose healing over hurting in the next moment, then do it again. A messenger arrived in the garden, one of Vorthak's communications officers. Sir, urgent message from the fleet. There's been a rebellion in the Proxima system. The local commanders are requesting immediate reinforcement. Vorthik looked at the message display. The rebellion was significant, threatening to destabilize an entire sector of his empire. Standard protocol would be to respond with overwhelming force, to make an example that would discourage other uprisings. Sir? The officer waited for orders. Vorthak looked at David, who was still tending his plants. The human's hands were gentle, as he worked, nurturing growth instead of destruction. Then he looked at Krex, who was watching them with obvious concern. Tell the fleet to stand down, Vorthak said finally. Sir, you heard me. Send a message to the rebels. Tell them I want to negotiate. The officer's face showed complete bewilderment. Negotiate, sir? Yes, find out what they want, what their grievances are. See if we can resolve this without violence. The officer looked at Krex, who nodded slowly. You heard the commander. Send the message. As the officer left, Krex moved closer to Vorthak. Sir, this is a complete departure from our standard operating procedures. The other commanders won't understand. Then we'll help them understand. And if they refuse? Vorthik considered the question. Some of his commanders were as committed to violence as he had been. They might not be willing to change, might even see his new approach as weakness to be exploited. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. David looked up from his plants, soil still clinging to his hands. Change is never easy, but it's always possible. For the first time in 3 centuries, Vorthak began to believe that might be true. The morning of the 4th day brought a crisis that would test everything Vorthak had learned. A massive warship entered the system, its hull bearing the insignia of Commander Thrak, one of his most ruthless subordinates. The vessel took position directly above the colony, its weapons trained on the medical facility. Vorthak stood in the facility's main corridor, reading the communication from his former ally. Thrak had decided that his commander had been compromised and was taking action to restore proper order to the Empire. The message was clear: surrender or watch the colony burn. Sir, Krex said quietly, Thrak has 3 full battle groups with him. If we resist, the colony will be destroyed. Vorthak looked around the medical facility. Patients from dozens of species lay in beds, recovering from injuries. His own soldiers worked alongside colonists, sharing meals and stories. David moved between them all, offering care and comfort to anyone who needed it. Evacuate the facility, Vorthak commanded. Sir? You heard me. Get everyone out. All patients, all staff, all colonists. Move them to the underground shelters. As his soldiers began the evacuation, Vorthak found David in the treatment room, calmly packing medical supplies. You should go with the others, Vorthak said. Someone needs to stay with the patients who can't be moved. David, Thrak will destroy this building. He won't care about medical neutrality. Then I guess we'd better find another solution. Vorthak stared at the human's calm face. Even facing certain death, David showed no fear, only determination to continue helping others. The courage was so complete that it made Vorthic's centuries of conquest seem small by comparison. I could surrender to him, Vorthik said. Let him take me. He might spare the colony. Would he? Vorthik considered Thrak's personality. The commander was ambitious and ruthless, seeing any form of mercy as weakness. He would likely execute Vorthik and then destroy the colony anyway, just to make a point. No, he'd kill everyone here to send a message. Then we need a different approach. The evacuation was nearly complete when Vorthik made his decision. He walked to the facility's communication center and opened a channel to Thrak's flagship. The massive reptilian face that appeared on the screen was scarred and brutal, with eyes that held no trace of mercy. Vorthik, you've fallen far from your reputation. Thrak, I see you've brought friends. I brought enough firepower to sterilize this entire continent. Your little vacation ends now. Surrender yourself for execution, and I might let some of the colonists live as slaves. And if I refuse, then I demonstrate what happens to commanders who go soft. This colony becomes an example for the rest of the empire. Vorthik felt the familiar rage building inside him. For 3 centuries he had responded to threats with overwhelming violence. His instinct was to call up his own fleet to meet Thrak's challenge with superior force. But as he looked around the medical facility, he saw David still calmly treating patients, and the rage transformed into something else entirely. Thrak, I want to show you something. I'm not interested in your excuses. Just look. Vorthik activated the facility's internal cameras, broadcasting images throughout Thrak's ship. The screens showed the medical facility in full operation. Beings from 17 different species working together, healing each other, sharing resources. Vorthik's own soldiers caring for former enemies with gentle hands. This is what I found here, Vorthik said. Not weakness. Not surrender, something I had forgotten existed. Thrak's face showed disgust. You've been infected by their softness. This is exactly why the Empire needs strong leadership. Tell me, Thrak, when was the last time you felt at peace? Peace is for the dead. No, peace is for the living. I had forgotten that. David appeared beside Vorthik, moving into view of the camera. The human looked directly at Thrak through the screen, showing no fear of the most brutal commander in the fleet. Commander Thrak, David said calmly, you're welcome to come down and see the facility. For yourself. We have medical supplies if any of your crew need treatment. Thrak's eyes narrowed. You dare address me, human? I address anyone who might be hurting. I am Thrak the Destroyer. I have burned 100 worlds. And I bet that hurt you more than it hurt them. The simple statement hit Thrak like a physical blow. Vorthik could see his subordinate's confusion and rage warring across his face. Enough of this, Thrak snarled. You have 1 hour to surrender, Vorthik. After that, I start killing colonists. The transmission ended, leaving Vorthik alone with David in the communication room. He's going to attack, Vorthik said. Probably you should have evacuated with the others. Someone needs to stay with the patients who can't be moved. Besides, this is where I belong. Vorthik looked at David's calm face, at the hands that had healed so many wounded beings. In that moment, he understood something fundamental about courage. It wasn't the absence of fear or the willingness to fight. It was the determination to keep helping others even when everything seemed hopeless. David, he said quietly, I need to tell you something. What? I think I understand now. What you've been trying to show me. And what's that? That strength isn't about how much you can destroy. It's about how much you can protect. David smiled. That's a good start. Vorthik stood slowly, his massive frame filling the small room. I know what I have to do. He walked to the center of the medical facility's main corridor. Around him, the last few patients who couldn't be evacuated lay in their beds. David's staff worked quietly, maintaining their care despite the threat hanging over them all. David, Vorthik called out. The human approached, still carrying medical supplies. For 3 centuries, I have been the galaxy's apex predator. I have conquered worlds, destroyed civilizations, and spread fear across 17 star systems. Yes, you have. But here in this place, I learned something that all my victories couldn't teach me. Vorthic's voice carried throughout the facility, reaching every being present. His soldiers, the colonists, the patients, all stopped what they were doing to listen. I learned that the greatest strength isn't in the power to destroy, but in the courage to heal. Not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to protect. Slowly, deliberately, Vorthek began to lower himself. First one knee touched the floor, then both. The galaxy's most feared predator knelt before a human medic in a simple colony medical facility. "David," he said, his voice breaking with 3 centuries of suppressed emotion. Teach me to heal again." David's hand rested gently on Vorthak's massive head. "You already know how, you just forgot." Around them, Vorthak's soldiers began to kneel as well. One by one, the beings who had spread terror across the galaxy chose a different path. They knelt not in surrender, but in understanding. The communication system crackled to life. Thrak's voice filled the facility, but now it carried uncertainty rather than rage. "Vorthak, what are you doing?" Vorthak looked up at the camera, tears streaming down his scarred face. "I'm choosing who I want to become. This is madness." "No, Thrak, this is healing." The transmission went silent for long minutes. When Thrak's voice returned, it was quieter, more confused. "The Empire will never accept this. Then we'll build something better." Hours later, as the sun set over the colony, Thrak's ships remained. In orbit, no weapons had fired, no colonies had burned. Instead, small groups of Thrak soldiers had begun requesting permission to visit the medical facility. Vorthek stood beside David in the facility's garden, watching his former enemies and subordinates work together to tend the wounded and repair the damaged buildings. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we heal," David replied simply. "One person at a time, one world at a time. It will take generations, all important changes do." Vorthek nodded, understanding finally that some victories couldn't be won with weapons or fear. They could only be achieved through the patience to heal old wounds and the courage to choose compassion over conquest. The galaxy's apex predator had learned the most important lesson of all, that the strongest beings were not those who could destroy the most, but those who chose to heal instead. And it had all begun with a simple human who saw past the monster to the healer within.